introductions about us, let me introduce our distinguished speaker. Professor Omid Safi is one of the leading public intellectuals for contemporary Islam and one of the leading Muslim intellectuals in the United States. He's a professor of Islamic Studies at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He's also the chair of Islamic Mysticism section at the American Academy of Religion. Omid was born in the United States, but he spent half of his time in different countries, in Muslim countries, Iran, Turkey, Egypt, Morocco, and India. He published enormous amount of books and articles, but beyond that, of course, he gave lots of lectures, and I should note here, and probably Omid may not have remembered, in my first teaching career at Ohio State University, 2004, we wanted to have him on campus, but he was so busy that he couldn't come, and I feel very honored and privileged that this time we could get him, because he has to spend some time with his family, but he does give these important lectures throughout North America. His important publications include Progressive Muslims on Justice, Gender, and Pluralism by One Word Publication, which is considered a groundbreaking publication in this field. Then he has another book on Islamic history, but his latest book becomes a bestseller. It's called Memories of Muhammad, Why the Prophet Matters. He has forthcoming books coming, one by Harvard University Press on Islamic reform movements in Iran, and a book on Mevlana Jalaluddin Rumi, a Sufi thinker, from Princeton University Press. Today we are honored to have him to speak about his book and why he wrote this book and what was his impression. And we will, after the initial presentation, we'll have a chance for question and answers, and then we will proceed for book signing and reception. Omid?
Professor Hammer, the friends at TMU, and the Fall for the Book Festival. It's a wonderful occasion to get the chance to be with you, and particularly anytime that the weather is so nice, to know that folks have made the deliberate and conscious choice to come and spend 45 minutes, an hour of their life indoors is something that is not without its moral accountability and responsibility. So I have a fairly boring pattern of beginning every single lecture, which is with a reminder of one of the key ethical teachings that emerges from the Islamic tradition, which is to be mindful of the finite and fleeting nature of time, or as it is often expressed in the Islamic tradition, the measured number of the breaths that we get to take in life. According to the teachings that this book attempts to portray, the number of breaths in our life are measured, and there is nothing that can ever be done to add a single breath to that pre-measured number or to take one away. And so in light of that, the best thing that one can do is to make sure that those moments, those breaths, are spent beautifully and wisely. And part of my goal for the 45 minutes to an hour that we have together is to make sure that you come away from this time richer and hopefully more informed about one of the key figures in our shared human history, the Prophet Muhammad. So I will begin by talking about how this particular book came to be. Most books have their own history, their own biography, and authors are particularly great liars at giving a retrospective account of how everything just flowed together in this seamless, intentional way of creating the final product. Mine's not one of those books. About 3 years ago, the largest publisher of books on religion and spirituality in America, HarperCollins, came to me and said, "We want you to write a book on Islamic history." I was like, "HarperCollins, I've heard of you. Yes, I'm interested. Go on, please." And they said, "We will pay you so much money that you can buy a car for your ego." I'm like, listening further, go on. BMW 3 Series, talk to me. And they said, "We want you to write a book called From Muhammad to Bin Laden." And I was like, you're hurting my soul, but I'm still listening. And they said, we are in the business of selling books. Now, Jimmy, this is not going to be on the website, is it? The folks at HarperCollins will never see
cut
this.
it out.
Thank you. He said that we've done a lot of research into the reading habits of Americans. And most Americans, those who still read, do so at what they refer to in their marketing division as a sitting. I was like, a sitting? That's a funny term for book reading. And it turns out that the term sitting is in fact quite appropriate because the number one room in the house in which most Americans now read is in fact the bathroom. And so what they wanted was a book of 15 chapters, each chapter broken up into certain segments, where you could read each segment of every chapter in a single sitting. The first chapter would be the Prophet Muhammad. The last chapter would be Uncle Osama. And it would be kind of a meandering trip through the 1400 plus years of Islamic history, a civilization that has spread initially from Morocco to Malaysia, and nowadays from Washington, D.C. to the South of America and beyond. I thought, all right, generally speaking, I'm against selling my soul, but in this case, everybody has a price. I'm willing to be bought. I'll write a book for you, no problem. I justified it to myself in all kinds of noble ways about the need to enter the public arena and inform the ignorant masses out there. You know, academics and men are very good at justifying things. So I started to write, and I was like, all right, first chapter is supposed to be the Prophet. Let's write that one first. So I need to talk about the Quran. Good. Start to write about the Quran, but how can I tell the story of the Quran without talking about the person through whom the divine revelation enters this world? So I wrote a lot about the Prophet in the context of writing about the Quranic revelation. Then I had to write about the Prophet, and write about the Prophet. Then at some point I figured out that much of Islamic history is the attempt for a quarter, a fifth of humanity to conform their highest spiritual aspirations to the lofty, lovely, and beautiful example of the Prophet. So if I want to talk about Muslim spirituality, Islamic ethics, I have to talk about the example of the Prophet. I'm writing about the Prophet. Then at some point I wanted to write about Islamic law and the ways that Islamic law has unfolded through the centuries. Well, Islamic law derives from two fundamental sources, the Quran and the example of the Prophet. So in writing about Islamic law, I started writing about it. I needed to write about Jerusalem because, you know, God has a great sense of humor. And he was like, well, I'm going to take this little place the side of Rhode Island and make it incredibly dear to all the Abrahamics. And then just step back, introduce first colonialism, and then nationalism, and just laugh my divine... Wait, I can't say that about God. No, God does have it behind, according to certain theological schools. God's going to walk back and watch us argue over this little tiny place. But if I want to talk about why does Jerusalem matter to Muslims, I have to talk about the fact that the Prophet Muhammad ascends to heaven from Jerusalem. Because in those days, apparently, Jerusalem is like the hub. And you can't catch a direct flight from Mecca to heaven. You have to fly to the hub first. So, in writing about Jerusalem, I'm writing about the Prophet. At some point, I wanted to talk about what is it that everybody and their grandmother wants to know about Islam. The two questions. Are Muslims inherently violent? I was like, we will be if you keep asking that question. And then there's the woman problem. So if I'm writing about gender debates in Islam, of course I have to talk about the Prophet's own interaction with his wife, initially, and his wives later on, with his daughters. So I'm writing about the Prophet when I'm writing about gender debate. Next thing I know, I have a 300-page book, which is basically not from Muhammad to bin Laden, but kind of from Muhammad to Muhammad. And I'm very nervously picking up the phone and going, Mr. HarperCollins, how would you feel if your Muhammad to bin Laden book was a Muhammad to Muhammad book instead? They said a few very bad words, and then they said, you're a naughty, naughty boy. Don't ever, ever pull this kind of, then they said another bad word. Again, let's see if it sells. And so they published it. Alhamdulillah, it has sold. And so now they don't say bad words anymore, which is great. So back to the justification for why a person would spend a few years of his life reading through a good chunk of what Muslims historically have had to say about the Prophet, the foundational sources of Islamic thought, the Quran, the seerah, the biographies of the Prophet, the words of the Prophet, and so on. I've been giving talks in front of mixed audiences, mixed faith audiences, for about 25 years. Hundreds of talks in churches and synagogues, some mosques, civic groups, and what have you. One of the things that I do oftentimes, instead of just jumping in and speaking with people about Islam, or about the Quran, or about the Prophet, is to try to get a sense of the religious literacy of my audience. And so I begin with those traditions that I assume are more familiar to the audience than Islam is. I ask them, what do they know about the Christian tradition? And hands, eager hands, always go up. I live in the South. The hands are particularly eager. And so I ask them, tell me about the life of Christ, and more importantly, tell me about a few episodes, a few moments in the life of Jesus where you feel like those highest Christian virtues are embodied. So again, eager hands go up. They're like, it's when Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan. It's the parable of the prodigal son. They know lots and lots of stories where Jesus-y ethics are lived out. Okay, good. Then I'm a teacher. My job is to make things increasingly harder as the semester goes on. Then I ask them about Judaism. And in many places, especially the South, the eager hands come down. Name for me some of the loftiest ethical and spiritual aspiration of Judaism. With Christianity, they had no problem. It was like love, redemption, salvation. If you mention love, we own love. We have a monopoly on. Nobody else loves like we love. Pet peeve of mine. With Judaism, eventually somebody says, redemption, the law. You know, the boring stuff before Jesus came along. He was a Jew. And then tell me some stories from pivotal Jewish figures where those Jewish ideals are lived out. A lot of silence, a lot of, don't make eye contact. Don't make eye. This is like the same lesson that 8-year-olds know and 50-year-olds know. As long as you don't make eye contact with the speaker, they cannot call on you. It's like, yes, I can. You with the gray shirt, 6-year-old. They're like, he called on me. I wasn't making eye contact. He broke the rule. Then you keep making it harder, and you ask them about the Hindu tradition. Tell me something about spiritual ideals that arise out of the Hindu tradition. And they're like, oh crap. Okay, what do you know? Cows, yoga, reincarnation. Can you name me one Hindu example? Gandhi. Name a second one. Crap. them about the Buddhist tradition, compassion, non-attachment. Tell me something about the life of the Buddha. He got tired someday, sat in the shade of a tree, some cosmic stuff happened, he became the... Other than that story, most people don't know any anecdotes, any narratives where the highest Buddhist ideals are actually embodied and enacted. Then and only then do I circle back around to come to Islam. Now, here's a funny thing. Depending on how you count things, Islam has been under the spotlight, in the middle of our public discourse and our global discourse, maybe going back to 9/11, maybe going back to the mid-80s, when a few Muslims decided to hijack planes without paying for them, maybe going back to the Iranian Revolution, a little bit further back. We've had, depending on who's counting, either 9 years, 20 years, 30 years, where Islam has dominated our public discourse. And yet, when you ask most people to name a spiritual virtue, an ethical ideal that emerges from the heart of the Islamic tradition that would be comparable to compassion and non-attachment for Buddhism or love for Christianity, they draw blanks. And then when you ask them, if the Prophet Muhammad is the exemplar par excellence for Muslims, tell me some narratives, some anecdotes from the Prophet's life where those Islamic ethical, moral teachings are lived and enacted. You get a deafening kind of silence. So, in writing this book, what I decided to do was not to write it in the manner of traditional seerah biographies. It was not to simply offer a translation of Arabic, Persian, Urdu, and Turkish biographies of the Prophet Muhammad. Rather, my goal was to say, if one was going to survey the last 1400 years of Islamic thought, what narratives, what key moments in the Prophet's life have been seen by Muslims as best exemplifying the highest spiritual aspirations of the Islamic tradition? And then let's talk about them. To not do so would be as odd as if we had had 30 years of public conversation about Islam with most people knowing nothing about Jesus. And that's precisely where we are in terms of our public discourse. We have just come through a month where idiotic pastors from my hometown, close to it, of Gainesville, Florida, who have two claims to fame. One, they're growing a mustache that's going to be on the Guinness World Record. And two, they want to burn the Koran. And they can be an international superstar. Why do we have this urge to put a microphone in front of the idiots? There's plenty of good people in the world, in this country. Hundreds and thousands of churches and mosques and synagogues where people are adapting and adopting each other's scriptures, where Muslims and Jews and Christians and Hindus and Buddhists and atheists and agnostics are working to build homes. We don't hear from them. Why? Because we thrive on conflict. That's our issue, our problem, not theirs. Anyway, this last month has been difficult with the whole Park 51 controversy, the so-called Ground Zero Mosque. As I keep telling people, it's not at Ground Zero, and it's not a mosque. Need I say more? But we keep talking about that instead of trying to have this more illuminating educational conversation. And yet something funny happened as I started to actually write this book. I really did, as a good, bleeding heart, communist, granola eating, I would drive a Prius if I wasn't in love with BMWs. Tree hugger, Obama loving, lefty, pinko communist. I really thought it's my job to educate those ignorant non-Muslims out there. I'm as elitist and snobbish as most people on the far left tend to be. But then when I started to write, lo and behold, I discovered that the ignorant masses is us. That ignorance, just like love and beauty and hatred and prejudice, doesn't run a line between and among nations and faith communities. It is actually a daily struggle inside each and every one of us, inside each and every one of our communities. Another way of saying it is to say that I also discovered, much to my chagrin and sadness, that Muslims, contemporary Muslims, we ourselves are also ignorant about huge parts of the life, teachings, and legacy of the Prophet Muhammad. And I'll illustrate that in just a little bit. One way that I can do so is to give you an aspect about the Prophet's teaching that I'll come back to in a few minutes. The other one is visual. So we're going to look at some miniatures done by faithful and pious Muslim artists through the centuries. Just so nobody gets freaked out and offended, this ain't the Danish cartoon crap, right? These are works by devoted Muslim artists through the centuries, paid for by the Muslim Khalifa, by the royal courts of the Ottomans and the Safavids, the zenith of Muslim civilizational power, to offer pietistic representations of not just the Prophet Muhammad, but Abraham and Moses and Jesus and Noah and what have you. Some of what I'm going to show you here comes as a shock and a surprise to many Muslims who've always been told Muslims don't depict the prophets. How do we account for the fact that we did, but today many think that we didn't? The other issue is more at the level of imagination. And I'm going to come back to this idea in a little bit. Here's a taste of where we're going to go. If you ask people to identify the key spiritual moment of Siddhartha Gautama, then Buddha, they would say it's when he sits under the Bodhi tree and he vows never to get up until every last blade of grass has the opportunity to achieve enlightenment. If you ask people to identify the key spiritual moment of Jesus' life, they would say it is the crucifixion and then the resurrection. And if you were to ask Muslims, what is spiritually the most powerful spiritual moment of the Prophet's life, for most of the last 1400 years, they would have said it is the Mi'raj, the heavenly ascension, where the Prophet comes face to face with God. It is that ultimate encounter that every religious seeker searches for. And here's the part where I say that ignorance, what I've called in this book, just to be nicer, spiritual amnesia, forgetting of what we once knew, is not just something that is a monopoly of non-Muslims, but Muslims ourselves are guilty of this. In a pre-modern time, an early modern time, the Mi'raj is the event that spiritually defines the Prophet for Muslims. Yet, if you pick up a modern biography of the Prophet Muhammad, even a good one, so being a little bit biased, what do I think is the best traditional seerah of the Prophet in English? Martin Links's book on the Prophet, Muhammad, His Life, based on the earliest historical sources. 400-page book, beautifully written, very accurate, about a page and a half devoted to the Mi'raj. In other biographies, modern biographies, 1 page out of 300 is devoted to the Mi'raj. It'd be kind of like writing the life of Jesus, where there's a page on the crucifixion and the resurrection. It seems a little imbalanced. But yet that says a lot about us and not so much about the Prophet. So what I want to do is to give you a sense of what visually has tended to be lopped off, to be forgotten by many people through this artistic tradition. What we have in the Islamic tradition, going back about 1,000 years, is a genre of books that tend to be referred to as Qisas al-Anbiya, the tales of the prophets. Tales of the prophets. The stories in the Quran of the prophets tend to be very short. It assumes, and it says so, we're going to tell you a story that you've already heard. No story in the Quran ever begins by saying, I'm going to tell you about Abraham. You've never heard of them before. In fact, every story says, this is the story of Abraham that's already familiar to you. The audience of the Quran was supposed to have known these stories through the oral tradition. Over the centuries, when Jews and Christians convert to Islam, people don't tend to forget that which they have known previously. Many of those Jewish and Christian narratives also become translated and incorporated into the Islamic lore. One way that these snippets from the Quran are developed into full narratives is through this genre of Qisas al-Anbiya, which later on become illustrated. So here you have a particularly fine example from the 1500s in the Ottoman Empire, where it's the chronicles of all the prophets. And they begin at the beginning with Adam and Eve. And those of you in the back see some of these images? Yes? Good. And if you take a look at it, you'll see that their images of Adam and Eve are every bit as anachronistic as our images of Jesus being a Scandinavian, blonde, blue-eyed, white-skinned, hair down to here, hippie, first-century Palestinian Jew. There weren't a lot of blonde first-century Palestinian Jews. They looked like me. Short and stocky, brown and furry. I hate Jesus was probably bald or balding, just like most of us Middle Eastern men tend to be. And yet, we imagine Jesus in our own image, or at least image of Northern European white people. So when the Turkish and the Persian artists are imagining Adam and Eve, well, they look like they're sitting in the Persian garden, they're wearing Persian robes, and their features look particularly Central Asian / Turkish. Why? Because the Turks are paying the bill. They're the ones who are paying for the miniature, so the father and mother of humanity are going to look like Turks. Deal with it. Here you have the world's smallest zoo, aka Noah's Ark. Must have been smelly. And you see people drowning at the bottom, with a few of them that are saved. Noah's Ark narrative from the Islamic sources. The story of Abraham. This is one of my favorite ones to speak about because it illustrates how much of what it is that we have forgotten. If you walk down the street and find your Abdullah on the street Muslim and ask him, which son was Abraham going to sacrifice? You're going to hear unanimously Ishmael. Well, I happen to think it was Ishmael because there was a time in which Abraham had one son, the firstborn Ishmael, who was older. And look, if you're going to kill your child, I'm a father of 4 children, I have a teenager, you don't want to kill the 3-year-old. The 3-year-old is cute. They're still cute. God makes them cute so you don't kill them. And by the time that you do, it's too late. You already love them. The teenager, the one whose room looks like a pigsty and believes that shower is something best postponed for an annual celebration. And his friends are all equally smelly, just like, that's the one that you would kill. And God sends an angel and says, Abraham, lo and behold, you don't have to kill your boy. And Abraham is not too pleased. He's like, I've got the dagger, I've got the boy, I will be done with him in just another second. Muslims historically had a debate about which son was to be sacrificed. The Quran doesn't name the son. And some Muslims, the majority tradition, says it was Ishmael. A minority opinion of Muslims, mainly those from the Jewish tradition convert background, said that it was Isaac. Right? And yet Muslims have forgotten that earlier debate. Examples of Jesus and the Virgin Mary. And then and only then do we get to depictions of the Prophet Muhammad. So I have a two-part slide here. The book on the left is a book that I really hold up as a great source of inspiration for me in having written this book. A book by the late and great scholar of Islam, Anne-Marie Shimokhanum, called "And Muhammad is His Messenger." It's a reminder that the declaration of faith in Islam is a two-part statement. It is not sufficient to say, I believe in one God. That doesn't make you Muslim. It just makes you a monotheist. You could be Jewish, you could be Christian, you could be certain varieties of a Hindu, and still testify to that. It is actually that second statement, and I believe that Muhammad is a messenger of God, that lends the particular fragrance to your religious cosmos. The example of the right is an artist's depiction of the Prophet Muhammad of a variety that is quite commonly found all over the place in modern Iran. It's a personal example for me because this is a depiction of the Prophet that has been in my house for about 40 years. Every time that I've gone from a dorm room to an apartment to a townhouse to a house, I've taken this artistic depiction of the Prophet and hung it up to remember the teachings of the Prophet. I didn't think anything of it because millions of people in Iran have these as posters, of artistic depictions, as necklaces, as what have you. Some years ago, a very orthodox Sunni Pakistani friend of mine came to our house. He loves the Islamic artwork that we have in our home. Went around, saw the calligraphy, think, oh, this is beautiful. What does it say? Well, it's a Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim that I got from Istanbul. And that one, Allahu nuru samawati wal ard. Where did you get that? Cairo. Oh, that's lovely. We go around admiring, and we get to this. And he says, who is this sheikh? Who is this spiritual elder? And I was like, dude, that's the Prophet, man. And his color changed. And he said, Muslims don't depict the Prophet. I was like, what are you talking about, Willis? It was like, they obviously, they do. And he was like, but they don't. Dead. See? It's right there. But they don't. So after 2 minutes, but they don't, but they do, but they don't, but they did, but they don't, but they don't, he goes, but they shouldn't. I was like, okay, so if we're having the shouldn't conversation, instead of the they do or they don't conversation, that's a separate thing, right? What's interesting is that depicting the Prophet is not a Shi'i thing. In fact, the overwhelming majority of depictions of the Prophet and of all the prophets that we have come actually from the Sunni tradition, not from the Shi'i tradition. But it's one of those things that in a modern context is mainly forgotten. You could find depictions of the Prophet, most often with his face veiled by a veil of light, but occasionally also with his face unveiled, present in the Iranian context, which remember Iran was the heart of the Sunni tradition, right? Remember that? In the Ottoman context, in the Central Asian context, and the South Asian context. Not only that, aspects of the Prophet's life were also depicted in part of the historical tradition. So here's an account of the birth of the Prophet. And interestingly enough, this is something that's still celebrated as the Mawlid in certain places, or in the Turkish context, the Mevlud. And it is the Mevlud which really was one of the key features of familial and women's piety in Ottoman Islam. It's kind of like celebrating Christmas, except you can do it whenever you have an occasion. So you have a wedding, you celebrate the birth of the Prophet. you had a large gathering to celebrate the birth of the Prophet. So historically, Muslims in a Turkish context would read an elaborate poem told from the perspective of women, in particular the Prophet's mother. And the translation of that poem is in the book. And it's an absolutely transformative, powerful, mystical account where Amina describes the Prophet inside her womb as leading forth to lights that shoot out in every direction, and the angels and the great women of the past, including Asiya and Virgin Mary, descending down upon her house, her entire house being illuminated, and all the angels coming down and welcoming, if you would, the Prince of Peace. Not surprisingly, that kind of an account was so near and dear to many Muslim women historically and even today. The Mawlud sounded like that, but slightly more devotional. Here we see the Prophet in prayer in Mount Hira. And by the way, almost all of these miniatures are things that you can see in some of the best museums in the Turkish context, the Iranian context, and other places. I got the permissions for a lot of these from the Topkapi Museum in Istanbul. And we see the Prophet in prayer in the Kaaba. Now, I'm going to try to stop talking in 8 minutes to have some time for question and answers, and I will read for you 3 short selections from the book. The first one that I picked is the example of what happens to the Prophet when he is chosen by God to deliver the message. If you know your Bible, you know that when a prophet is chosen by God, this is not a happy occasion for the prophet. No prophet ever comes to his or her community and says, God has chosen me to deliver you the message, and people say, Alhamdulillah, we have been waiting for you. Thank you, let us embrace you, and let us transform our evil and heathen ways. A prophet comes to call out his community. That's what a prophetic message is. It is not to say to his or her people, you're doing great, don't change a thing. You're doing a wonderful job with the women, the orphans, and the widows, and the travelers. God loves you. Every prophet comes and says, repent now, for the judgment of the Lord is upon thee. And they all speak in perfect Victorian English. And the prophet, too, in coming down the mountain, is filled with a sense of what, in the older days, we used to call having an experience of awe. It was an awesome, or even in Victorian English, awful experience that fills him with a sense of awe at the enormity of the cosmic responsibility that has been handed to him. And he goes to his best friend, to his closest confidant and companion. And if you say, Ali, you've been brainwashed by Shi'i propaganda. And if you say Abu Bakr, you've been brainwashed by Sunni propaganda. Because the person that he goes to is to his wife, Khadija, the first Muslim. We sit around and argue, who was the first Muslim? It wasn't Ali, it wasn't Abu Bakr. It was Khadija, but because she's a woman, we tend to overlook her. God provided this comfort through his wife Khadija. She was the first to have faith in God through Muhammad, and the first to believe in the authenticity of Muhammad's experience. She was, to put it more bluntly, the first Muslim of the Muhammadi path. Khadija's support is not left in the abstract. Rather, the biographical account of Ibn Ishaq provides 2 different narratives in which she comforts and shelters Muhammad from his spiritual storm. No longer just Muhammad, but now the Prophet. He approached Khadija and sat close to her. The Prophet confided in her that he was concerned that he might become like those poets possessed by the jinn. Khadija responded in compassion, I take refuge in that, Abu Qasim. God would not treat you thus, since He knows your truthfulness, your great trustworthiness, your fine character, and your kindness. This cannot be, my dear. What really caught my eye was that "my dear" phrase, because this is not the Prophet and Khadija talking. This is husband and wife talking. And the second narrative that Ibn Ishaq, who is Ibn Ishaq? The writer of the oldest surviving biography on the Prophet. This is something that no third-wave post-colonial feminist could have dreamt of it as any better. Oprah would be salivating over this thing. And yet, we don't hear this second historically authentic narrative preached in any of the American mosques that I've ever been to in my life. Why? Because it's intimate. It's very intimate. In this narrative, Khadija says to the Prophet, next time that you see the angel come, let me know, and I will sit with you and to see if it's an angel or a demon. So the angel comes, and the Prophet's like, he's here. Khadija asked Muhammad to sit by her left thigh, which Muhammad obliged her by doing. She asked Muhammad, do you still see him? Muhammad answered in the affirmative. She then asked Muhammad to sit by her right thigh, and she repeated the same question, which Muhammad again answered in the positive. She then asked him to sit in her lap and asked him if he still saw the angel. Yes. She then loosened the knot on her robe and unveiled her body while Muhammad was still sitting in her lap. At this point, she held the Prophet in the naked embrace of a husband and a wife, which the biography describes as, this is the quote from the Arabic, the messenger of God, peace and blessings of God be upon him, was between her and her slip dress. She then asked him, do you still see him? Muhammad answered, no. Khadija said, rejoice and be of good heart. By God, he's an angel and not a Satan. The justification being, if it had been a demon, no demon, and most men, wouldn't have run away from the sight of a naked body of a beautiful woman. But because angels, like good men, have a sense of modesty, it would have left the husband and wife alone in that intimate moment. It is one thing to speak of Muhammad as the Prophet, the messenger of God, in terms of his relation to God. Muslims have also imagined Muhammad as the model human being who also illustrates the perfection of every human relation. He is not merely the Prophet, he also demonstrates how to be the ideal husband and father, which is crucial in portraying the life of intimacy and affection. We have other miniatures that depict Khadija actually initiating the marriage proposal to the Prophet. And then we get to the narrative of the Mi'raj, technically the Isra and the Mi'raj, the trip to Jerusalem and up to heaven, as we have talked about it. Accompanying on Buraq to Jerusalem and up through heaven. By the way, you get a sense of how rich some of these Ottoman depictions are, with cobalt blues and oranges and reds. And some of them, like this one, which is now at the Met from the 16th century, depict the Prophet being surrounded by cherubic angels. He goes through the levels and layers of heaven step by step, meeting with the different prophets. Here's his meeting with Hazrat Adam, through ever higher states of paradise, getting a view of the garden, and also a tour of hell, because just as was the case in the Christian tradition, where Jesus tours hell and liberates people, and you see the broken locks and keys. In Christian iconography, the prophet also visits those who are being tormented in hellfire. Here, those that have done the worst thing ever, which is not covering their hair, but rather, in the worldview of the Quran, devouring the property of orphans. That's the go straight to hell and stay there forever kind of action. It is when the prophet has his face-to-face encounter with God that I've recorded in the book a lengthy account of how this particular episode has been imagined by Muslims, and I'll just say two quick things about it. One, if there's one thing that tends to distinguish your more typical, common, ordinary Muslims from the more mystically oriented ones, is that all Muslims are to have reverence, respect, admiration, emulation towards the Prophet. All Muslims would say, the Prophet got to see God face to face, and thus we will strive to emulate him in our daily account. The more mystically oriented ones would say, the Prophet rose to see God face to face, and we will follow. Everyone's going to get to see God face to face in the hereafter. It's the mystics that are just a little more impatient, and they want God here and now. At the zenith of the Prophet's spiritual experience, when he has this intimate encounter with God, God gives him a choice. Ya Muhammad, you can stay in the state of bliss that you are in perpetually. Or, like the Buddha, you can return out of compassion to this realm of dust and shadows so that others too can have a chance to rise in your footsteps. And the tradition has recorded the Prophet's response as simply the Arabic word, ummati, my people. So to choose the spiritual illumination of his people over his own personal bliss. Great and luminous Muslim saints, Abdul Qaddus Gangohi from South Asia, have said, I swear by he in whose hand is my soul, had it been me, I would have stayed. It's those kinds of actions. When I tell you that Muslims historically remembered the Prophet not as the nation builder, not as a 20th century Egyptian called him, the socialist imam, but as rahmatun lil alameen, meaning a source of mercy to this world, and in fact to all the worlds. Carl Sagan would be orgasmic. As many universes as there are, the Prophet would have been a source of mercy to them as well. It's because of those narratives. Not only does he arrive, but he also returns. Not only does the Prophet arise to the mountain to receive the revelation, but he comes back down to deliver the message. And the last thing that we're going to see before me hushing, the hardest thing for people to do up here, is to take a look at the conquest of Mecca. The Prophet is born in Mecca, he's raised there, he's married there, his children are born there. He's exiled, becomes an immigrant, his followers are threatened. He goes to Medina, where the city, sorry New Yorkers, there's another city that claimed the title of the city 1400 years before. Madinat al-Nabi, the city of the Prophet, is established. And then at some point, triumphantly, he returns to Mecca. I'll read for you a quick paragraph. By this point in Muhammad's life, his fame and following had grown to the point that he was able to subdue the Meccan forces. The movement of the Hijrah, the migration to Medina, had also come full circle, and the time for leaving his home was over. It was time for Muhammad to return to his earthly home, Mecca, where he had been born, where the first revelation had come, and where the house of God, the Kaaba, would be the central pilgrimage site. Less than a generation earlier, all that had stood between him and certain death was a cave hidden by a spider web spun by God's plan. That was part of God's plan, and the return too was part of the divine plan. Mecca, where Abraham's temple had been built, was about to be redeemed. This redemption had to be one bathed in mercy. Then I go on to recount some of the little details. And people say the devil is in the details, but so is God, and so is compassion and mercy. The prophet sees a female dog that had given birth to a litter of puppies. And he was worried that an army of 10,000 people might disturb the puppy. So he sends one of his followers as guard over them. One of the companions, this is one of the Sahabis, the companions, you expect them to be illuminated. He was rejoicing that day that this is a day of war and sanctuary no more. And the Prophet orders Ali to take the standard away from this companion. The key moment for me, though, is the question of forgiveness. If the Mi'raj, the ascension, is the zenith of the Prophet's spiritual life, the conquest of Mecca is the zenith of the Prophet's political and military career. It is one thing to preach nonviolence and forgiveness when one is politically inferior, and entirely another to mercifully forgive when one has the power to demolish. It is one thing to forgive a faceless enemy, but quite another to reconcile with those that have persecuted us and our loved ones. Muhammad came face to face with Hind, who had devoured the liver of Muhammad's uncle Hamza. When she declared her intention to embrace Islam, Muhammad simply said to her, "Welcome." When the son of his former nemesis, Abu Jahl, entered the area, Muhammad bid his companions to not speak ill of Abu Jahl, for, and I quote, "Reviling of the dead gives offense to the living and reaches not the dead." What I want to just say in wrapping up and hopefully opening things up for questions is, when I think about what Muslim authors, Muslim intellectuals, and much of the Muslim community has done over the course of the last 10 years, I think we have spent the bulk of our energy discussing and proclaiming over and over again what Islam is not. We have repeated ad nauseum that Islam is not about extremism, not about terrorism, not about patriarchy, not about misogyny, not about anti-Semitism, and so on and so on. And yet, virtually no human being that I have ever met in my life gets up every morning and says, "I will choose to follow the path of this tradition because of what this tradition does not teach." No one is a Christian because of what Christianity is not. No one is a Jew because of what Judaism is not. And no one is a Muslim because of what Islam is not. My hope at some point is that we can return the focus to where things actually belong, to a discussion of what all of our traditions, faith traditions and other traditions, actually do have to say, and how they can be a force for good, for justice, for all, not only in the sense of commit no evil in my name, but rather how can Islam, and how can all of our faith traditions be a means of creating a just world, a lovely world, and a world in which our children can grow up in a way that their dignity, their integrity is given and not up for assault. I'm going to stop here and see if you have questions and comments and follow-up points for discussion.